Wyoming Territory, June 1873, the smoke curled up from the ridge, and by the time Odessa Nolan saw it, her cabin was already gone. She stood frozen beside her mule, a sack of flour cutting into her shoulder, the heat of the flames distant but real. The pine trees beyond her home caught the glow like torches. Her garden was trampled, the fence torn down, and the door hung crooked from its hinges. Odessa's breath caught sharp in her chest. They had waited for her to leave. She had gone into town at first light to trade eggs and mail a letter. By the time she returned, the world she built alone after her father died was nothing but ash and broken wood. She ran. The sun dropped fast behind the granite peaks as Odessa's boots sank into the river mud and her skirts clung damp to her legs. She did not stop. Not when her foot twisted on a root, not when she heard the night birds call. She had one thought disappear. There was a cave, she knew, tucked into the rocks above the creek. She had found it once during a storm the summer she turned 19. It was dry, hidden, and safe. She hoped. By the time she reached it, her hands were scraped raw, her dress torn, and her throat tight with held-in sobs. She dropped the flour sack. It split against the stone floor, white dust blooming into the air like smoke. She collapsed, curled into herself near the back wall, and finally let herself cry. The tears came silent and hard. She did not make a sound, but her shoulders shook and her breath hitched. She heard the wind whip outside and the low hush of the creek below. Somewhere, an owl called. Her hands trembled as she wiped her face. She did not hear the horse until it was close. Hoofbeats slowed at the edge of the creek. Whoever it was dismounted with a quiet step. She tensed, heart pounding, and reached blindly for the small knife she kept under her belt. A voice came low and steady. "I am not here to hurt you." The man stepped into view, tall and broad in the shoulders, dust on his boots and a rifle slung across his back. His hat was pulled low, but the firelight from his lantern lit his face clean-shaven, maybe late 20s, with eyes that scanned the cave carefully before settling on her. She pressed herself back. "Who are you?" He knelt slowly, setting the lantern down between them. "Name's Jedediah Sutton. I was riding east toward Laramie when I spotted smoke. Then I saw tracks, figured something bad happened." Odessa stared at him. "They burned everything." Jedediah's eyes softened. "You alone?" She nodded. He looked around, then stepped back and sat on a flat rock near the cave entrance. "You got a name?" "Odessa," she said. Her voice cracked. "Odessa Nolan." Jedediah nodded once. "You hurt?" She shook her head. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. He did not ask her anything else. Instead, he pulled a canteen from his saddlebag and set it beside her. "Water." Odessa took it, her fingers brushing his. She drank, slow and careful. The cold water steadied her. "You saw who did it?" Jedediah asked quietly. "No," she said. "But they waited for me to leave. They meant to take the place clean. Anything left?" She shook her head. "Just what I carried." Jedediah was quiet for a moment. "There is a camp half a day's ride from here. Miners mostly, but honest men. I can take you there if you want." Odessa pulled her knees to her chest. "I do not want to be around anyone." He watched her a long moment, then gave a slow nod. "Then I'll stay nearby," she blinked. "Why?" "Because no woman should be left alone out here after what you have been through." Odessa looked away, but her throat tightened all over again. She did not have the energy to argue. He turned and stepped outside. A few minutes later, she heard the soft clatter of hooves and then silence. She thought he had left. But when she crept to the edge of the cave, she saw him, his horse tethered to a tree, and he was spreading a blanket near the creek, his rifle beside him. He did not leave. The next morning, she woke to the smell of coffee. Jedediah was crouched by a small fire, brewing it in a tin pot, the early light golden on his shoulders. He looked up when she stepped out. "Morning," she nodded, wrapping her arms around herself. She stepped closer, drawn by the warmth. He poured a cup and handed it to her. "You get any sleep?" "A little." He waited until she drank before speaking again. "I want to go to your cabin, look around, see if I can find tracks, maybe get an idea who did it." "You think they will come back?" "Doubt it." "They got what they came for." She hesitated. "Then why go?" Because you deserve to know who stole your home." Her eyes met his. He meant it. She saw that in the way he looked at her steady, like he would not turn away. "All right." He rode off after breakfast. She stayed near the cave, washing her face in the creek and trying to comb the dust from her hair. She felt stripped bare, but the quiet of the trees and the sound of the water steadied her. He returned before sunset. He handed her a folded scrap of cloth, her father's old bandana. "They left it behind," he said. "Tracks lead northeast, 3 horses, maybe 4. Could be the same crew that hit the miller's place 2 weeks ago." She clenched the cloth in her fist. "I want to go after them." Jedediah did not smile. "And do what?" "You have no home, no weapons, and no one to ride with you. His brow lifted. "You said no woman should be alone out here." He scratched his jaw. "That is different from chasing down thieves." She stepped closer. "I need to do this, Jedediah." He looked at her hard, then nodded once. "Then we ride in the morning." That night she sat beside the fire while he cooked beans and salt pork. He handed her a plate and sat across from her. The moonlight caught in his hair, and for the first time she noticed how gentle his hands were, how careful he moved. "You always come through this way?" she asked. He looked up. "Only when I am restless," she half smiled. "You seem calm to me." For now, she watched the fire. "I did not expect anyone to come." He looked at her for a long time. "I could not have left you there." Her heart beat heavier. She looked away, unsure what to say. He added softly, "You are not alone anymore, Odessa." She met his gaze, and for the first time in days she believed it. They broke camp before first light, the sky still holding onto the last of the stars. Odessa's legs ached from sleeping on stone, her fingers stiff against the morning chill, but she didn't falter as she swung onto Jedediah's spare horse. The saddle was worn but sound, and she rode with the quiet determination of someone who had nothing left to lose. Jedediah led them north, down a narrow ravine where the sage grew thick and wild. They followed the track's light impressions in the dust, a broken branch here, a churned-up patch of earth there. He said little, glancing back only to make sure she was still behind him. She always was. By midday, the sun beat hard on their backs. They stopped beneath the crooked arms of a juniper tree, where Jedediah passed her a strip of dried venison and a hunk of cornbread wrapped in oilcloth. Odessa chewed slowly, her gaze fixed on the horizon. The silence between them wasn't heavy, only worn in like old leather. Jedediah drank from his canteen, then tilted his head toward her. "You ever tracked before?" "I hunted with my father when I was younger," she said. "Mostly deer, sometimes elk if we were lucky." He nodded, chewing thoughtfully. "You're riding like someone who's done it before. Living alone teaches you things." He didn't push further. Instead, he rose and brushed crumbs from his coat. "They're moving fast but not careful. That tells me they're not expecting to be followed." "Then they're fools," she said. She stood, dusting her skirt. "You think they'll hole up somewhere?" Could be heading toward the bighorns. Plenty of places to vanish in those hills. Odessa glanced toward the distant ridgeline. "Then we keep going." They rode into late afternoon, the sun casting long shadows across the hills. The land grew rougher, the trail harder to read. Jedediah dropped from his horse more than once to study the signs, his hand brushing the earth like he was listening for something it hadn't said yet. By the time they reached a dry wash, the light was thinning and the canyon walls loomed high and narrow. Jedediah raised a hand, bringing them to a halt. "Tracks split here," he said. 3 went left, 1 veered off to the right. Could be a scout." Odessa dismounted, her knees stiff. "Then we follow the lone rider. One's easier to catch." Jedediah looked at her, then nodded. "He'll be less likely to notice 2 riders behind." They climbed the far side of the wash and followed the high trail until the wind shifted and carried a smell to them: wood smoke, faint but steady. Jedediah motioned for silence and dropped low, leading his horse by the reins as they crept forward. A half-mile on, they found him. The man had built a small fire in the shadow of a sandstone bluff, his horse tied loosely to a nearby bush. He was young, maybe 20, with a rifle across his lap and a battered hat pushed back on his head. He wasn't watching his surroundings, Jedediah crouched beside Odessa behind a boulder. Where I can go down and talk to him." She studied the man's posture. "If he's part of the crew that burned my cabin, I don't want words." Jedediah didn't argue. He handed her his rifle and pulled his own from his back. "Then we go careful." They moved like shadows, their boots silent on the sand. Odessa's heart pounded, but her hands stayed steady. When they stepped into the firelight, the young man scrambled to his feet, reaching for his rifle, but Jedediah had his leveled first. "Don't," he said. The man froze. Odessa came forward, rifle aimed. "You ride with 3 others." The man's mouth twisted. "I don't know what you mean." Jedediah took a step closer. "You were seen near a burned homestead 2 days south. We want names." The man swallowed. "I didn't start no fire, I just ride for him. They didn't say what they were doing." Odessa's voice was calm. "You were there." He looked at her, then dropped his gaze. "They said the place to be empty." Jedediah reached into the saddlebag and pulled out a coil of rope. "You'll ride with us, you talk, maybe the law goes easier." The man didn't fight. They tied his hands and rode through the dusk until they found a patch of flat ground near a shallow spring. Jedediah built a fire, not large, but enough to keep the cold from their bones. As night settled, Odessa sat across from the man, watching him in the firelight. He wouldn't meet her eyes. She didn't speak. Jedediah sat beside her, close enough their shoulders nearly touched. He didn't offer comfort, just his presence, steady and quiet. After a while, the bound man muttered, "I didn't know there was a woman living there. They said it was just land." Odessa didn't answer right away. She let the silence stretch, then softly, "That was my father's land. He built the cabin with his own hands. I planted every row of beans. Every board in that house had a story." The man looked down. Jedediah reached for the pot on the fire, poured 2 mugs of coffee, and handed one to her. She took it without a word. They sat there, the 3 of them, the only sounds the crackle of fire and the wind whispering through dry grass. Later, when the stars wheeled high and the bound man slept beside the fire, Jedediah spoke low beside her. "You didn't flinch once today." "I couldn't afford to." He turned toward her. "That kind of strength doesn't come from nowhere." She looked into the flames. "It comes from losing everything and still waking up the next morning." His gaze didn't waver. "You didn't lose everything." She met his eyes, and something steady passed between them, something unspoken but real. "No," she said, "not everything." They didn't touch, but the distance between them felt smaller than it had before. The fire burned low. The night held. And for the first time in days, Odessa felt the faint pull of something like hope. They reached the edge of the Red Butte foothills by the following afternoon, the prisoner riding behind Jedediah with his hands bound and his head low. The trail had grown steeper, the air thinner. A hawk circled above them once, then vanished behind the bluffs. Odessa kept her horse steady, her eyes scanning the rock walls and narrow passes ahead. The man had named the others during the night, names she didn't recognize, but Jedediah did. Small-time rustlers who had turned to easier pickings, cabins, lonely claims, outposts without fences. He said there might be a hideout in the western draws, a place he'd heard about from a friend who rode through last spring. No law came this far without cause. They stopped near a dry spring. Jedediah dragged a branch across the trail behind them to blur their tracks. Odessa watered the horses at a seep trickling from the rock, then stood, brushing her hands on her skirt. "Why do you know their names?" she asked. Jedediah cinched his saddle tighter. "Used to ride dispatch between Cheyenne and Rawlins. You learn who to watch for. Heard of them or rode with them," he straightened slowly. "I never took from anyone who couldn't stand to lose it." "That doesn't answer me." He didn't look away. "I moved some cattle for men who weren't honest. I was younger. I stopped when I saw what it did to families." Odessa nodded once. "You stayed close to the edge." "I pulled back before I crossed it." She studied him, then picked up her rifle and swung into the saddle. "Let's find the rest." They followed the prisoner's directions up a ravine where the brush grew thick. Jedediah rode first, his rifle across the saddle horn. Odessa watched the walls above them, where shadows moved without sound. They reached a bend where the path narrowed to a ledge. Jedediah dismounted, looped his reins, then motioned for silence. He climbed ahead, boots careful on the loose stone. Odessa waited, every muscle taut. The prisoner shifted behind her, rope tight across his chest. She didn't speak. The wind stirred dust across the path. Jedediah returned after a few minutes, crouching beside them. "They're up there," he said. "3 men, maybe 4, horses tethered in the brush. They've built a lean-to near the rocks." Odessa's jaw tightened. "Sleeping? One's cooking." "The others are scattered, 2 at cards, 1 walking perimeter." She looked toward the ridge. "We wait until dark." Jedediah shook his head. "They'll post a guard. Best chances now while they're spread thin." She ran her thumb along the rifle stock. "How do you want to take them?" "They won't turn on each other. But if we can pull one down to the trail, quiet and fast, he might talk." Odessa looked at the prisoner. "He'll call out." Jedediah met her eyes. "We leave him here, tied and gagged." She nodded, dismounted, and knelt beside the young man, tying cloth across his mouth before walking him to a patch of scrub behind a boulder. He didn't struggle. By the time they returned to the ledge, the sun was dipping behind the rocks, casting long shadows over the ravine. Jedediah motioned her forward. They moved up the rise one at a time, boots silent on the gravel until they reached a ridge above the camp. The scent of meat drifted up toward them, mingled with the tang of unwashed bodies and wood smoke. Odessa could see 2 of the men now, one tall and lean, the other broader, with a long scar down the side of his neck. They laughed too loud, cards scattered between them on a flat rock. Jedediah pointed to the cookpot. "That one's alone." They circled around, low to the ground, until they reached the edge of the lean-to. Jedediah raised a hand, waited for the wind, then stepped forward fast. The man at the fire turned just as Jedediah grabbed his collar and drove him to the dirt. Odessa moved in, rifle trained on the others, but they were too far to hear over the wind and laughter. The man under Jedediah's knee thrashed once, then froze at the feel of cold iron against his throat. "Say a word and you lose your tongue," Jedediah whispered. The man stared up at him, eyes wide. Odessa crouched beside them. "You burned my home," he frowned. "We didn't hurt anyone. You didn't care if someone was inside." Jedediah pressed the rifle harder. "Where's the rest of what you took?" The man hesitated. "In the cave behind the lean-to." Odessa stood and moved toward it, pulling aside the canvas flap. Inside, she saw the cracked lid of her mother's flour crock, her father's tobacco tin, and a folded quilt with the stitching undone at the corners. She closed her eyes, then stepped back into the light. Jedediah hauled the man up and bound his hands with a length of leather strap. "You'll walk with the others." They moved swift after that. Jedediah returned to the trail for the prisoner. Odessa circled the ridge, rifle in hand. The men at the card game never saw them coming. By dusk, the thieves were tied at the base of the ridge, mouths gagged, wrists bound behind their backs. Jedediah stood watch while Odessa retrieved what was hers from the cave. She wrapped the quilt around her shoulders, the scent of wood smoke still clinging to it. When she stepped into the firelight again, Jedediah was sitting beside the lean-to, sharpening a knife on a flat stone. "That's yours?" he asked. She nodded, holding the quilt tighter. "My mother pieced it before the fever took her." He watched her a moment, then set down the blade. "We'll ride to town in the morning. There's a marshal in Sweetwater Station who'll take them." She sat beside him. "What then?" "I'll ride west, find work." Odessa looked toward the fire. "I'm not going back to the cave." He didn't answer at first, then, "There's a lot of land west of Rawlins, good soil, plenty of water this year." She turned toward him. "You know how to build? I've raised fences, dug wells." She held his gaze. "I can grow anything that roots." The silence between them shifted, deeper this time. Jedediah's eyes softened and he reached for her hand, calloused fingers warm against hers. "We could make something new," he said. "You'd stay?" His voice was steady. "If you asked." Odessa didn't look away. "I'm asking." He nodded once, slow and certain. "Then I'm yours." They sat by the fire as the wind eased and the stars came out, the quilt wrapped around both their shoulders. Behind them, justice waited in the dark. Ahead, the land stretched wide and waiting. And for the first time, neither of them would face those behind them as they left the ravine. 4 men roped and riding under watch, the trail brushing along dry ridges and down into pale green basins. Jedediah kept his horse even with Odessa's, his gaze flicking often to the prisoners, but he didn't speak unless it was needed. They moved at a steady pace, the morning winds carrying the scent of juniper and dust. By midday, they reached the edge of a shallow valley where cottonwoods grew along a split in the earth that cut west toward Sweetwater Station. Jedediah pointed to a bluff above the creek. "We'll stop there. Water the horses, rest the animals." Odessa nodded and guided her mare toward the trees. The air beneath the canopy was cool, the creek running low but clear. She crouched beside the bank, dragging her hands through the current. It felt good to stop, if only for a while. Jedediah was already working the knots from the prisoner's reins, tying them in pairs to a nearby trunk. He came to where she sat and handed her a strip of cloth dampened from his canteen. "You've got dust on your face." She lifted her chin, letting him wipe it away. His touch was careful, his fingers calloused but gentle. "You always carry extra rope and water?" she asked. He lowered the cloth. "I learned the hard way what happens when you don't." Odessa leaned back on her hands. "Where was that?" "North of Medicine Bow. I was riding with a wagon train freight mostly. One man broke his leg near a gulch and we had nothing to splint it with. Took hours to get help back to him." She glanced toward the horses. "He make it?" Jedediah's jaw shifted. "He did. Barely." She stood and walked with him back toward the camp. The prisoners sat quiet, one of them watching her with narrowed eyes. She met his stare without flinching, then turned to Jedediah. "Will the marshal hang them?" He adjusted the cinch on the nearest saddle. "Not likely. Unless someone's dead, he'll jail them a while, maybe send them east to face charges." Odessa picked up a stick and dragged it through the dirt. "That doesn't feel like enough." Jedediah didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was low. "Justice out here isn't always clean, but we do what we can." She looked up. "You think I'm wrong to want more?" "No. I think you're brave to want anything at all." They rode on after an hour, the light falling long across the valley. Odessa's legs ached from the saddle, but she didn't complain. Jedediah kept the pace steady, checking the sky often as clouds began to gather to the southeast. By evening they reached the edge of a ranch claim half-built, with a corral and a small barn but no main house yet. Jedediah called out before they reached the fence, and an older man stepped into view, rifle in hand. He wore a patched vest and a hat gone soft with time. Jedediah raised a hand. "Marshal's expecting us, just passing through." The man eyed the prisoners. "What they do," Jedediah nodded toward Odessa, "burned her land, took what wasn't theirs." The man spat into the dirt. "You need a place to sleep, you're welcome." Winds turning sharp. Inside the barn, the hay was dry and the air smelled of animals and old wood. Odessa spread her blanket in a corner farthest from the entrance. Jedediah set his rifle nearby and unrolled his own bedroll beside hers without asking. She watched the rafters as the wind picked up outside, rattling the loose boards. "You ever think about stopping?" she asked. He propped his head on his arm. "I used to think I wasn't made for it. And now," Jedediah watched her through the dim light. "Now I think I was just waiting." She shifted onto her side, her voice quiet. "For what?" "For someone who wouldn't look at me like I was something to be wary of." Odessa reached across the space between them, her fingers brushing his. "You're not." He linked his hand with hers, slow and sure. "Neither are you." Sleep came easier that night. The wind howled through the eaves, but inside the barn, there was warmth from the straw, from the horses, from the steadiness between two people who had come through fire and chose to stay close. In the morning, they would ride the last stretch to town. After that, something new would begin. Not a return, there was no going back, but the start of something they would build themselves, plank by plank, acre by acre. And this time, no one would take it from them. By the time they reached Sweetwater Station, the late spring storm had passed through, leaving puddles in the wagon ruts and a new coat of mud on the main street. Odessa kept her coat drawn tight. the chill still hanging in the air despite the sun now angling down from a clear sky. The marshal, a slow-moving man with a stiff leg and a permanent squint, took the prisoners without more than a glance at Jedediah and Odessa, already scribbling their names into a leather-bound ledger. "Won't be much trouble," he said, jerking his head toward the back of the jail. "We've got room enough." Odessa watched as the men were led through the iron-barred door and out of sight. She didn't feel lighter exactly, just settled like a door had finally swung shut behind her. Jedediah stood beside her, arms crossed over his chest, his hat pushed back as he looked down the road. "You hungry?" he asked. She nodded, her voice quiet. "I think I could eat something warm." They found a table in the corner of the boarding house kitchen, where the woman who ran it served up rabbit stew and thick slices of bread. Jedediah ate slow, his eyes on the window. Odessa sat across from him, spoon silent against the bowl. "You ever think about staying here?" he asked. She shook her head. "Too close to what I lost. I need someplace that doesn't hold the shape of it." Jedediah set his spoon down. "I passed through a stretch of land west of Rollins last fall, no fences yet but the soil's dark. 2 shallow creeks, plenty of stone for building. I remember thinking it looked like a place someone could last." Odessa folded her hands in her lap. "You remember the land that well?" "I remember the way it made me stop riding for a minute." "Not much else ever did." She sat still for a moment, then said, "I want to see it." They left the next morning, taking what supplies they could carry, and a team of mules bought off a trader headed north. Odessa traded her mare for tack and seed, and Jedediah picked up lumber where he could find it cheap, strapping it to the wagon's side with worn leather cords. The land he'd spoken of rose gently from the flats, ringed on the far end by a low ridge that caught snowmelt and fed the 2 creeks. Odessa stepped down from the wagon and walked the length of the field, her boots sinking into earth that smelled rich and untouched. "We could build there," she said, pointing toward a slight rise near the waterline. "The ground's high, the wind would break against the hill." Jedediah walked beside her, hands on his hips. "You think you could make something grow here?" She knelt, pressed her palm into the dirt. "I know I could. It took weeks to raise the walls." Jedediah cut pine from a stand 2 miles west, dragging the felled trunks by mule and shaping each beam with steady hands. Odessa dug the root cellar herself, sweat streaking her back, her knuckles raw, but her eyes always clear. She marked rows with string and planted beans, potatoes, and squash from seed she'd carried in a tin beneath the wagon seat. They spoke little while they worked, but when the sun dropped low and the wind softened, they sat close on the stoop and watched the shadows stretch across their land. He would hand her a cup of boiled coffee and she would lean against his shoulder, not needing to say anything at all. One night, after the roof beams were set and the door hung straight, Jedediah found her standing beside the creek, her hair loose in the wind, sleeves rolled to her elbows. He stepped beside her, hands in his pockets. "I've been thinking," he said, voice low. She glanced toward him. "About what?" "About permanence." Odessa turned to face him fully. Jedediah took a breath. "I've never had a place that stayed mine. Never had someone who looked at me like I was worth staying for. But when I see you here, with your hands in the dirt and your eyes on the ridge, I feel like I've come home." She didn't speak, just reached for his hand, threading her fingers through his. "I want to build more than just walls," he said. "I want to make a life with you, one no one can burn or take." Odessa stepped closer, her voice steady. "Then stay. Stay and be mine." He kissed her there, by the water, the wind in the cottonwoods and the stars just beginning to rise. It wasn't hurried or uncertain. It was slow, full of everything they hadn't said but had carried all along. They married before the season turned. A circuit preacher passed through with a wagon full of hymnals and a Bible worn thin at the edges. He stood beneath the cottonwood and spoke the words, but it was the way Jedediah looked at her, like she was sunlight after a long winter, that made it real. They planted apple saplings before the first frost. Odessa sewed curtains from scrap muslin, and Jedediah carved her a rocking chair from aspen. The back curved just enough to catch the light through the window. Years passed quiet and full. In Odessa's garden bloomed wide and green, the squash curling thick along the rows, the beans climbing taller than a man's waist. Jedediah built a barn strong enough to weather the storms, and when he wasn't working, he would sit beside her as she shelled peas, their knees touching beneath the shade. One autumn, she held their firstborn in her arms, a boy with his father's calm eyes and her steady grip. Jedediah carved his name into the beam above the hearth, and that night, as they sat beside the fire, he laid his hand against her back and whispered, "Thank you for saving me." Odessa turned to him, her voice warm. "We saved each other." They grew old in that house. The wind came and went, storms passed through and fires burned far off, but the cabin stood. The garden fed them. The love between them, built quiet and strong, never wavered. And on every morning she woke with his hand beside hers. Odessa knew she had found what she had thought lost, forever, a life not borrowed or broken, but truly, completely hers.